Good morning, everybody. Nicole, are we ready to get started?
Yes, sir, we are. Good morning.
Great. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started with the CVTA Transit Service Governance Subcommittee. We are meeting this morning, Friday, April 23rd, to continue our work on developing the Transit Service Governance Report for the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. Most of the meeting this morning will be working with our consultant team at AECOM and Eno Center. We have a statement regarding virtual meetings that was posted on our website along with this meeting agenda. We have not received any public comments as far as I know, and we'll get to that further on the agenda. And I think at this point we can turn it over to Nicole for a roll call.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'll start with Charles City County, Ms. Russell. Chesterfield County, Ms. Smith.
Here.
Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas. I see you, Joe.
I'm here. My mute was blocked.
Good morning. Henrico County, Mr. Yor.
Here.
Powhatan County, Mr. Shardine.
Here.
City of Richmond, Ms. Clark.
Here.
DRPT, Ms. Dubinsky.
Here.
Virginia Transit Association, Ms. Guthrie.
Here.
GRTC, Ms. Torres.
Here.
And Plan RVA, Mr. Parsons.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance.
Thank you very much. Let's move immediately into the first item. Are there any proposed amendments to the agenda as it was presented? Okay, hearing none, let's move on to item 2, approval of the meeting summary from April 9th, 2021. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to review it, and we will approve this meeting summary by consensus. Does anyone have any updates or changes that need to be made to those minutes? Please unmute yourself and let us know. Okay, thank you. Hearing none, we'll approve the meeting summary by consensus. Let's move into item 3, the public comment period. I'm not aware of any public comments submitted. Nicole, have you seen anything?
No, Chad, I have not. Sorry about that. No, I have not.
Thank you very much. Okay, item 4. I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie and Peter to kick off their update.
And I'll leave this in Stephanie's very capable hands.
All right, thank you very much, and good morning. Good to see you again. We've been making very good progress on the project. So since our last call, we've been able to do one more interview to speak with the Virginia Department of Transportation and made more progress in the benchmarking task, looking at the MVTA and HRTRAC as well as finishing up the peer study. Now, one of the agencies we included in our peer study, which was Rock Region, our contact from there hasn't come through. So we will place the details of that study in the report when we are able to get a call back from them. So I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay. So what you're looking at here is just a description of the study progress. The full circle in task phase 1 is not fully covered because we still want to get some feedback and comments from for the benchmarking task before we can wrap that up. But in the meantime, we are done with the GRTC governance assessment, the peer study, and what we'll be looking at today will be the CVTA benchmarking. We've completed an extensive round of stakeholder interviews, speaking to about 40 different individuals from 13 different representative groups. The next phase of this study, which we'll be focusing on next week after this session, is looking at the details of the transportation district. So that will come with evaluating the transportation district, delving into the legislation in the state of Virginia to see what the provisions are, what the authorities, what the powers are, and then looking at any potential benefits in setting up one in the Central Virginia area. Next will be phase 3, which focuses now on identifying potential strategies for governance options. Part of it is already shaded because we've already started doing the comparison or evaluation of GRTC against the peer studies, which we sort of did side by side when we were doing the peer study. After we wrap up that section, which is probably the main section. After we wrap up the evaluation of the strategies, we'll have a draft report due for review by the CVTA and the steering committee by June 11th, so that it can be ready for comments and revisions for submittal by the end of the month. So I'll go straight into the next portion of reviewing the peer study assessment. So from last time, we weren't able to go through all the agencies. So for today, what I'll do is just briefly review the Nashville area, which was what we ended up on. So we'll be looking at the MTA and the RTA there in a little bit more detail. Then we go into MVTA, HRTRAC, and then talk about the next steps. So what you're looking at here are the agencies that we selected for the peer study. As I mentioned, Rock Region is on this list, but we are still working on the contacts within that area. So for the Nashville area, they have an interesting system, which is they have the MTA, which is the transit authority set up by the city of Nashville, and then they have the regional authority, which includes many more counties and many more jurisdictions. So we'll look at each of these two. They have some other smaller entities in the region. However, MTA and the RTA carry about 95% of all the transit in the area, in the region, sorry. So for the MTA, it was set up by the city of Nashville. So they currently don't have any taxation authority. Rather, they are funded through the city's general budget for the most part. It's made up only they provide services in the city of Nashville and the county of Davidson County. So their board is pretty simple. It's made up of 5 members that each have 5-year staggered terms. It's appointed by the mayor, but then it has to be approved by the city council. The only requirement is that they need to be residents of the city or the jurisdiction, and they should have lived there for at least 3 years. They do have the authority to use alternates or delegate their powers. Another interesting thing about MTA is that they don't have any elected officials on their board. It's all citizen representatives. The officers for their board constitute the chair, vice chair, secretary. And the secretary does not need to be a member of the board. So it can be someone outside of the 5 board members. But they do have strict requirements for what the secretary needs to have, the qualifications. The secretary needs to be a practicing attorney at the Board of Nashville. Also needs to be at least 30 years old and be able to have serve in that capacity of the secretary without having it affect or having their private practice affect their duties as an officer of the board. For voting, they go through a simple majority process. With 3 members present, they can constitute a quorum, meaning they can go through their official duties. The MTA doesn't have bylaws per se. What they do is the legislation that an agency was created by, it allows them, the board, to set up any procedures and policies that they need to operate the agency. So that's what they do. They don't have identified bylaws. They just go strictly by what is in their legislative, the legislation, as well as whatever they need to operate. For any changes in governance for the MTA, since it's a city, it was set up by the city, although it's called an authority, really is a branch of the city government. They need the city council's approval. So any change would go to the city council, and then the city council would have to put it out for a public vote. Because of the tedious nature of this process, they rarely make any changes to their legislation because it has to go through that voting process. So
Stephanie?
Hey, Stephanie.
Yes.
Stephanie, it looks like Barb has a question.
Yes, Barb.
I noticed that for both the MTA and the RTA, the T stands for transportation.
Mhm.
Are these set up specifically for transit, or are they transportation in that they might use tax money to fund a road project?
The MTA provides just transit.
The MTA is just transit.
Yeah.
How about the RTA?
The RTA as well, they provide van pool, commuter rail, and commuter bus. So I think
Okay.
the terminology, yes.
Okay, thanks.
And they're funded through the general city budget. Anyway, they don't have any special tax for both. So what you're looking at here is just a general setup, the org structure for the MTA, which follows is pretty general from the board of directors to the CEO and then the top management. For the RTA, it's known as the Regional Transportation Authority of Middle Tennessee. So in some documents, it will be RTA MT or just RTA. I think currently they just go with RTA, but in their legislative documents, it goes by RTA MT. Now, the RTA was set up in 88. They also surprisingly do not have taxing authority. So how they're funded is through membership contributions. Their primary funding source though is CMAQ funding. And that was interesting to me from the CEO. Their primary funding source is CMAQ, but their general funds comes from the member contributions. They also have a local assessment that is paid. So to be part of this regional entity is strictly voluntary. So for an entity, for a jurisdiction to opt in, they would do that by just paying that local assessment, which is either $500 or 10 cents per capita. And if they want to withdraw from the regional entity, they would just have to let the board know that they will not be participating. So then they wouldn't pay that yearly fee. So by not paying the yearly fee is sort of them saying they don't want to participate. So it's a strictly voluntary basis. I spoke with Steve Bland, the MTA. He is the CEO for MTA and for RTA because the RTA uses MTA's employees. So they provide management contract services for the regional entity. And for the most part, they have a very collaborative nature. They do everything very collaboratively between the two agencies. So the regional entity, RTA, provides the van pool services, commuter bus service, as well as the commuter rail services. And they operate on that basis of providing services to connections to downtown Nashville. That's their model, basically. And for that, they use they use a third-party operator as well as MTA staff. So they themselves have no employees. Everything is through the MTA. The board for the RTA is pretty large. It's made up of 39 individuals. Currently, they have 37 of those positions filled. The 39 people are from the counties, the cities, and then there are 10 governor appointees. They do have, because many of the members on the board are elected officials, they just serve out their term. And for the governor appointees, they serve out a 5-year term. The governor appointees also have to have some knowledge of transit, either operations or service. So that's what it's not like a requirement, but then their legislation says that they try to make the person knowledgeable, select someone that's knowledgeable in transit, service, or operations. The officers of the board, again, are just the chair, the vice chair, secretary. What they do try to do is to make sure it includes at least one appointed member and one elected member so that they have that balance. Currently, they don't have any veto power. None of the jurisdictions have any veto power. So from the largest jurisdiction to the smallest area, they each have just one vote. And the way they mainly operate for the RTA is through what they call the corridor committees. So the corridor committees are formed by each corridor, since they have these commuter rail and commuter bus routes, the jurisdictions through which a particular commuter bus route passes through forms that committee. And what they do is they plan for and pay for the service for that corridor. So for the most part, they don't have a lot of issues when it comes to voting because they only deal with whatever affects their corridor. And that's how they usually operate for their voting. So if a particular corridor wants to pay for more service, as long as they can get the members of their jurisdictions to agree, they go with that. Everything that is done at the committee level, though, still has to go for the board approval. So besides the corridor committees, they also have some of your other committees that you find at other agencies. That's the Finance, Audit, and Operations Committee. What you're looking at here is a chart that shows the interaction between the MTA and the RTA organizations. So the RTA board, like I mentioned, has the 39 members, but then they operate through a contract management services provided by the MTA. And then the MTA staffs their agency using the Davidson Transit Organization, which is a nonprofit for their employees. So ultimately, the RTA's employees are from the Davidson Transit Organization. This chart here shows the organizational structure for the RTA. So it shows the CEO of the MTA still as the main CEO for RTA, and they, for the most part, share the same employees as well. So that's the general structure for them. These two charts show the funding structure for operating funds for 2019. For the MTA, majority of their funds comes from the city of Nashville. So they get about $50 million on an annual basis. And the other funding sources are the standard for the federal and for the state as well. But for the RTA, majority of their funding comes from the CMAQ funding, that's federal. And then they also have the member contributions as well as the local assessment. One thing that our interview with the Nashville area brought out was that they have a caucus of mayors for the area. And because they have that collegial relationship between the mayors of the area, it makes running the organizations very smooth. They rarely disagree on issues. They are able to talk out any issues that they have. So for the most part, the MT and the RTA, they are able to work hand in hand and very collaboratively. That was the sense that I got, that everyone gets along. They meet each other at all the other board meetings, and they all know each other. So for the most part, they can just talk everything through. And so that's how they've been working so far. And so from here, I'm going to now go into just looking at a summary of the 4 entities that we've looked at. So the chart that you're looking at shows that amongst the agencies that we've looked at so far, we see that only VIA Metro in San Antonio has that taxation authority. So in a sense, although they're all called authorities, VIA Metro is the only one that does have that tax that they levy. The other interesting thing about their board that I'll show on the next table is that they also have no elected officials. So they are able to control the funding by the board that they already have. And their board representation is still nominated by the city council, the mayors, and the counties to serve on the board. For HRT, which we'll talk about a little later, they have now the new funding source from the HRTRAC. So that is also a new funding source that can help with transit services. For voting purposes, all the agencies right now have that simple majority. There's no weighted voting. However, it's been discussed in some, especially for HRT, it's been discussed, but it hasn't been implemented yet. For voting, the only, for veto power, the only entity that shows, that has it in their legislative documents is for HRT, where one jurisdiction cannot impose some new service into another jurisdiction unless they also vote for it. So each entity has complete veto power as long as it's within their boundaries. And that was something interesting. Via Metro, like I mentioned before, their primary source is their sales tax, but then they also have their ATD tax, which is another transportation district tax. And HRT, RTA are similar in the sense that they also operate through the member contributions, which is very similar to what GRTC currently has. Every year they have the annual contributions by the members. So it's just based on that. So now that we are done looking at the summary of the peer agencies, what phase 3, the component that phase 3 has is now just looking at all the information we have and comparing that with GRTC and talking about where we can draw some opportunities to improve the GRTC structure, and that will inform the options that we're going to form for transit regional governance. So looking at the main issues in the Central Virginia area and identifying what strategies that we can draw from these other entities in order to address those issues, those key issues. So we'll be looking at that a little further down in phase 3. Now I'm going to transition into the 2 agencies that we were looking at for the benchmarking. These 2 were the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and MVTA, and the second one was HRTRAC. So for these 2 entities, we looked first at what their legislative standing was, their general governance structure, their committees and voting structure, as well as their funding. So for the first thing I wanted to point out for MVTA is that they're interested in that they are they don't exist, they're not isolated. There are several other Northern Virginia entities that interact. So there's the MVTA, and then they have their funding entity, which is the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority Fund. And then there's the Northern Virginia Transportation District, NVTD, as well as the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. So these circles are just to sort of show the relationship between all of these entities. The MVTA is made up of the counties as well as cities. So for the counties, we have Arlington, Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, and then the cities, which are also now part of the MVTD, that's the Northern Virginia Transportation District. So they're two separate entities, but it sort of contains them. The reason why the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority Fund was set up was that the MVTA in itself didn't have the legislative authority to collect the taxes or to collect funding. So the fund was set up to purely manage and collect the funds, and it just passes it through to the MVTA. And it's similar for the MVTD and the MVTC. Very complicated. But in Virginia, any tax needs to be levied directly by the state legislature. And that's why all these extra entities had to be set up. So for the MVTA, it was set up in 2002, along with the, set up in 2002, sorry. And then in 2013, they had to create the Northern Virginia Transportation Fund. So they are funded mainly by a gas tax, diesel tax, as well as a sales tax. And the way it works is that 70% goes to the regional priorities, and then 30% goes back to the local jurisdictions. The MVTA is really set up only for planning. They don't operate any transit or construct transit. So they are purely a long-range planning entity. They have a 6-year program the MVTA 6-year program, that's where they set their regional priorities, and it lists what projects that they are going to prioritize. They also have a project selection criteria, which is supposed to be performance-based, and it has different priorities that they try to address. And listed down here are, on the right bottom side, are some of the criteria that they try to address.
Stephanie, I've got a quick question. This is Barb.
Yes.
The Northern Virginia Transportation Authority Fund, that tax money goes only to the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, or does it go to those other two groups?
No, it only goes to MVTA.
Okay.
And then the MVTC's money goes to the MVTD.
And the
Yeah.
NVTC's money is
It's for
what's
the
that
cities.
source?
So
From
that's
cities. It's like
from
a
the cities.
contributions or sort of thing.
Exactly. So let me go back. The MVTD is for these cities: Arlington, Arlington County, Fairfax County, Loudoun County, and then the city of Alexandria, Falls Church, and Fairfax. They form the MVTD, the Northern Virginia Transportation District.
Okay, so really the Virginia Transportation Authority Fund and the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, those are sort of like fund sources
Yeah,
for
purely funding.
the authority and the district.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're purely funding, and that's because of the way the state legislature is made up, that these authorities cannot themselves levy the tax. It has to be done from the state.
Got it.
So the MVTA's board is made up of 17 members with representatives from each of the bodies, the jurisdictions, sorry. They serve a 1-year term each, and they also have representation from the House of Delegates. They have the Senate. The governor also appoints some citizen members. So they also have that representation from the CTV. They have 3 non-voting members. So the DRPT director, VDOT commissioner, as well as they have a rotating cycle for the towns that are in the jurisdiction. So since the towns are not directly represented on the board, each year they select a town that can be part of the board, but they are still non-voting. They also have a very interesting voting approach. They have 3 tests that each vote has to meet. So first, it needs to meet two-thirds of the voting members need to be present. That's the first one, so 10 of the 14 members. Then next, they also have to have 2/3 of the local government representatives. So 6 of the 9 jurisdictions represented. And then the final one is there also needs to be that population balance. So they need to have 2/3 of the populations of the jurisdictions represented. So if a vote meets each of these 3 criteria, then it is passed through. So the idea is to make sure that everything is very consensus based for the MVTA, and hence they have these 3 required tests for voting. They also have a committee structure that they operate by, but their committees are purely advisory in nature. They have the finance, the governance, planning, programming, planning coordination, and then the technical advisory committee, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So the technical advisory committee, the TAC, and then the planning coordination committee are the 2 that are statutorily required. The other 3 standing committees are the finance, planning and programming, and the governance. So the purpose of the TAC is it's made up of 9 members, and they're non-board members. So these are just representatives that are selected by the board. They don't have to be board members, but they do need to be residents and also have multimodal experience. So there needs to be a balance between bike and ped, transit, and other transit modes. The role of the TAC is focused on identifying projects for their transaction plan, as well as a 6-year program. And what they do is then apply those performance-based criteria in the selection of their projects. So that's the sole purpose of the TAC. They serve 1 to 3 year terms. The Planning Coordination Advisory Committee is another committee that I set up to also give representation to the towns that are not part of the board. So it's made up of the 14 elected officials from the towns and 9 localities. And what they also do is to provide their input and their recommendation. That way they can ensure this consensus-based approach for all the entities involved in there.
Stephanie, there's a question in the chat from Joe Vadunas about voting structure.
Yes. Okay, let me find it. Okay, was the voting structure prescribed by the code or determined by MVTA? I believe it's described by their code. Donna, if that is.
Yeah, the code specifically says that they need to be by consensus where possible is the phrase used, and the MVTA bylaws determined the exact specifics. But I will post the information of the code in the chat.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Hey, Stephanie, this is Chad. I had one more question, and you may have done it on the first slide, but are you collecting information on staffing structure? I'm just curious myself.
Okay, so we have the org structure, the general org structure for, and that's what you're looking at now. They have these 3 branches divided. They have the communications, admin and finance, and transportation. Is this what you're looking for?
Yeah, so is this all of the MVTA staff that work for Monica, or is this more of the
No,
are there others that aren't shown?
Yeah, yeah. We can look into the more detailed, broader org structure as well.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I'm not sure if it actually needs to be part of this report, but it's certainly helpful when we are looking at staffing for the CVTA.
Okay. So finally, is looking at their funding. Now the MVTA, their total funding for FY22 in the adopted budget, they have about $243 million in total. But that amount excludes a $59 million pot of money. So that's what is labeled as future financing. So when you take out that $59 million, that is for future financing, if needed, as they call it, then their total available budget is about $184 million. So that 59 may not be available for spending because it's already planned for future projects. But in total, their sales tax that they receive gives them about $197 million each year. So again, the sales tax is from the gas and diesel tax, as well as the sales and use tax. And that is what is collected by the fund and then funneled through them. They also get a state granted tax of about $25 million. And then the smaller funding sources are from other sources, as stated here. As mentioned before, they have the 30% that goes back to the local jurisdictions, and then 70% goes towards their regional priorities. So now I'm going to briefly go over the HRTRAC. Yes, Barb?
On Northern Virginia, how much of that Northern Virginia Transportation Fund money goes towards transit? And I know that there's no prescribed amount or percentage, but do we have an idea of how they go about deciding how much money goes to transit related projects? Or
so right now, besides their performance-based approach for selecting projects, I think we can look into a little more detail about the funding that actually is reserved for transportation and how much goes for transit. So we'll look into that as well to try to dig a little deeper into that transit component. So the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission, HRTAC, it was established in 2014. Similar to the MVTA, because of the Virginia laws, they also have this a fund, the Hampton Roads Transportation Fund. But the fund was set up with the original legislation with the mandate to fund bridges and highways. So it was a purely bridges and highways fund it didn't have a transit component. It's a local sales tax and a fuel tax. So what was done recently, just last year, was setting up another fund for transit. So that's the Hampton Roads Regional Transit Fund. And that is supposed to help alleviate some of the burden in the Hampton Roads area. So with the new fund that was set up, they are expected to have about $31 million annually. And it's also funded through a sales tax, as well as a hotel tax and some other statewide funding. So for the HRTF, the HRTF, and the HRTAC, the HRTF, as stated before, their mandate is for purely bridges, highways, and tunnels. So procuring, funding, building, operating. HRTF now has that transit component to it, where they can construct and operate regional service for interjurisdictional service and high frequency bus service. The HRTAC, it covers 14 jurisdictions. So they have the 4 counties and 10 cities in total. The HRTAC's board is made up of 19 voting members, but in total there's 23 of them. So they have representation from each of the counties and the cities, as well as from the House of Delegates and from the Senate. Then they also have the non-voting members, which we see as the standard from many of the Virginia agencies. You have the representative from the CTB, you have the VDOT commissioner, DRPT, but here they also have the Port, Virginia Port Authority, as a non-voting member. Their voting structure is much more simple compared to the MVTA. It's just a simple majority. They have to have at least 2/3 of the elected officials on the commission, and it also needs to reflect the region's population. For forming a quorum, they need majority, but then they also need to have the chief elected official. So whether from the city or from the county, from each of the counties, to make sure that each person is present to have that quorum. And they also operate through these committee structure. In their legislation, they allow ad hoc committees to be set up as needed as well. Okay, so the HRTAC, their primary revenue source, again, is the fund, the HRTF. That makes up about 78% of their funding. But again, this is purely for highway bridges and tunnels. But now with the introduction of the new transit fund, they can raise at least about $31 million annually. So this chart here, it doesn't include future HRTRAC funding, since this was just set up last year. So in the future, it will include this new regional fund, which should contribute about $31 million per year for the Hampton Roads region. So now that we've looked at these two entities, like was asked for, the HRTAC, their fund, as well as the MVT and their related agencies, we just did a simple comparison with the CVTA to review the structure, and we will have some more talks with Chet to find out if, like you mentioned, maybe looking a little bit more at the org structure or any other areas that you think would be beneficial to the CVTA. But in looking at the general overview, we see the CVTA has about 9 members, MVTA very similar, and HRTAC has many more members. Their board representation is pretty similar, 16, 17, 23 members. It's very similar, and it especially also includes those members from the House, from the Senate, from the CTB. This could be a function of the fact that the Virginia legislature just likes to have oversight in a particular way. Looking at the voting structure, like we said before, the MVTA has their complicated structure set up by the bylaws. The HRTAC just has that 2/3 for the jurisdictions and the regions. The CVTA has this population-based structure. CVTA, sorry, now has this population-based structure.
So Stephanie,
Yes.
this is Barb again. So the HRRTF money, the tax money specifically going to transit, is managed by HRTAC, the authority.
Yes.
How do they make decisions about where it goes, and how many transit agencies are in Hampton Roads? I think that's important. I feel like really the question we're trying to answer is where is there the accountability for spending the tax money
Mm-hmm.
generated by the funds that are set up for the authorities?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, is there an elected body that says that they are okay with that tax money being spent the way it's proposed?
Mm-hmm.
So even when
So
we were
for
talking
the-
about those agencies at the beginning, Nashville and Tennessee,
Yeah.
where's that connection between the tax source and the accountability for its spending?
It's vested in the board. So for the other agencies, it's all vested in the board. They review the budgets, financial documents, and approve those spending.
So
in
for
the case of
Nashville
fire-
and Tennessee, there are, some of those don't have any elected officials.
Exactly. So for Via Metro, they don't have any elected officials on their board. So the board as is the sole, they decide where the funding goes. So that's the sole body for making those decisions.
Are they appointed by elected
Appointed,
officials?
exactly, yeah. So the board is appointed by those officials from the city council, mayor, or the counties that are involved. So they do have that communication between the independent board and the elected officials because they nominate them. But for the most part, they are nominated into that position to serve the best interests of the agency. But there is that communication to make sure that their needs are met as well. But in terms of their legislative documents, they don't have that sort of, they don't have anything required in their legislation that makes room for the elected officials to influence that tax money. For Hampton Roads, for instance, right now that they have this new fund, so HRT will be the beneficiary for the HRTF. The Hampton Roads,
Oh, I see. So the HRTF money, the
yes, the regional
Specific-
fund.
specific to transit, goes to HRT directly,
yes.
not to HRTAC.
No, it goes to, so HRTAC is the body that will manage it. But the beneficiary in the region would be HRT. But what we will do is to look into more detail about other transit agencies in the region to see who the other entities that can benefit from it are. But at this point, the TAC is the one that manages the fund. So the tax board is what will manage the fund. The tax board has both. So of these 23 members, they do have elected officials on their board. And then they have the governor appointees. So
But
that would be that connection that you're asking for.
But HRT
Mm-hmm.
is an umbrella over all the little different transit agencies in Hampton Roads. It's another,
Sorry, no, that's not the case.
No.
So HRT is probably what you think is like the major transit agency, but there is also Suffolk Transit and then Williamsburg Area Transit that actually reside within the Hampton Roads area. And Lisa may know this better than I do, and I apologize, I don't know as much, but from my understanding, the funding is supposed to be for HRT in order to kind of help subsidize some of the reliance that they have on the local jurisdiction contributions that they need for their operating. So it's a little bit of a challenging situation, I guess, for HRTAC to figure out how to navigate that since the representation is very similar to kind of HRT's board.
whew,
Yes.
it's really confusing. Thank you.
Yeah. So does that answer your question for HRTAC as well as for the San Antonio area that also has that funding?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It'll take me a while
Nashville-
to get it all
Yeah, in
straight.
Nashville, they don't have a tax. So it
Stephanie, this is Diana.
Yes.
I was just gonna add a little, maybe a point of clarification for Barb, in that the CVTA, our CVTA, with them approving the regional transportation plan for GRTC, would be that tax source accountability checking point for what the transit dollars are doing
But
in
the-
regard to, I mean,
But the code doesn't require the CVTA to approve the regional transit plan. It says that GRTC will create the plan in collaboration with the TPO.
I think that I don't know, Chet, do you have any clarification? Because I would assume that the CVTA would vote on the approval of that plan.
I think the CVTA votes on approval of the projects that are identified in the plan. I don't think the CVTA approves the plan itself.
Hmm.
But
But
still be
that
approving
takes some.
what, yeah. I was just gonna say, it would be approving what the CVTA money would be spent on.
The priorities that are identified in the plan, yeah.
I think that might be what we want it to say. I don't know that it really says that.
Stephanie,
Yes.
it's Lisa Guthrie. Going back to the HRTAC, I just wanted to be specific about, there was a question about HRT and the other transit agencies in the region. I don't think those tax increases for that fund are levied outside of the HRT service area. I don't think that additional the additional sales tax or lodging tax is implemented in Suffolk or Williamsburg. I think it's just within the HRT service area. So I wanted clarification on that.
Yeah, it's the hotel tax is HRT.
Thank you, Donna.
So just while we're talking about it, the code itself on the GRTC plan says it's two different sentences. The first is GRTC shall develop a plan for regional public transportation in collaboration with the TPO. Then it says the GRTC shall annually provide to the authority sufficient documentation as required by the authority showing that the revenues distributed were applied in accordance with authority approval.
Oh, there you go.
So,
in accordance with authority approval. So it is after the fact, but that in accordance with the authority approval implies that there is some upfront review.
right. I mean, Eric's not on the call, but I'd certainly defer to his advice.
Yes, and I think the HRTAC has the most resemblance. I think Donna pointed that out, that to the Central Virginia area and how it's funded and the similarities. So we know that HRT, they have these committees that have serve as sort of a bridge between the staff and the elected officials as well, so that they have that input in different aspects. So whether it's the financing or the funding of the agency or operations. So they have many committees that is written into their code for HRT. So them going to be the main beneficiary of the regional fund that is set up. It will be distributed by the TAC. What we will look at is if they have a similar performance-based approach like the MVTA has for project selection. And going back to the previous question about how the MVTA voting structure was set up, it is written in the legislation. That these three tests for the voting structure is written into the legislation. So for our next steps, I think what we'll be working on is we do want to have that, we will have further talks with CVTA for the benchmarking to identify any other component that we didn't cover that may be of interest to CVTA to make sure that the structure for the benchmarking works out very well. Then we'll look into the legislation for the transportation district. We've already started looking into that, but now just itemizing the definitions for the according to Virginia law, who can be part of a transportation district and what are the powers and the authorities for such a district, and how would that apply in the Central Virginia area, whether in the same in collaboration with the CVTA and or GRTC, or some combination of one engulfing another, or what would that look like? Not that it'll be like an additional agency, but it could be like an agency that replaces another, or like takes engulfs one other, just looking at what those potential combinations are and if there are benefits for the Central Virginia area. We already have the funding branch, which is the CVTA. So when it comes to the governance and looking at how representation can be, or that accountability, is where the transportation district may look attractive, in that you have that opportunity to have to select the board, have your elected officials in that representation, and whether they're going to just look at what those different combinations are. Because for GRTC, we then have we have two things, right? We have the board representation, but we also have the shareholder ownership. So what does that really mean? If we make any changes to the board, it still needs to be voted on and approved by at the shareholder meeting. So then the ownership is that if the owners still need to approve the board, then the owners are still in charge, right? So what does that look like if they buy into the agency to become part owners, or everyone is comfortable with the existing ownership structure, but then voting on an expanded board? So those are conversations that need to be had. And then when it comes to ownership, what really do they own, right? Because there's the local interest, but then there's also federal interest. The feds will say they don't own the agents, they don't own assets, but then they do have an interest. So what is that conversation of the ownership, approval, or changes or to the shareholders look like? And what does that mean for board representation? Even if the board is going to be expanded, do we want the new members to also buy into the ownership of the company? And those are conversations that would need to be had between the entities involved. So we'll try to find the best way, the best path moving forward to get there. But what we would hope to do is to have these ironed out, what the main issues are and what potential strategies for addressing them would be. Because I think these are really deep conversations that still need to be had. Are there any questions at this point for us? Okay. If there are no questions, I think we are looking forward to going into the next phase and identifying, like I said, the main issues here. There's one for the board, but then there's also one about the ownership. So what does that look like? And how can we move forward with that? So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everybody. Is there any other business that the committee would like to discuss today? All right, hearing none, let's break and enjoy the rest of your day. Hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Take care.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you.